So over the past few months I was reading the works of Xenophon and Plato, and what I got through all of Xenophon, at least the works that I was interested in, and most of Plato, I decided to actually come back and just start over again, so I could go through each of the works I've already read, as well as other ones that I haven't got to yet, but I'll actually have the benefit of putting my camera on, recording it, sticking it on YouTube, if for no other reason that at some point in the future, whether that be several weeks from now, several months, years, or even a decade from now, I can come back and watch them and kind of reflect on my thoughts at the time and the work that I read, as well as, of course, if I'm making videos, there has to be a certain consistency. The level of thought and effort, what I'm taking out of the work, the notes that I would have to write, are going to have to be considered more deeply. So as well as getting more out of the work, in the meantime when I'm actually reading it, I'll also be able to get something out of it in future. And on top of that, I hope my girlfriend will watch rather, or listen to at least a fairly decent chunk of these, in the same way that I watch all of our videos. So that, in the same way that I engage with her passions, and I kind of see what she has to say about the works that she's working on, if you can also look at these, and hopefully benefit something from them. Again, hopefully, at some point I'll have an extensive library of them. With that says, I'm really just going to be focusing on philosophical works. However, the book that I chose to start off with was one from Xenophon that I hadn't read yet, which was The Education of Cyrus, which, while having some philosophical elements, especially in the start of the book, is largely a historical and biographical piece. So, for the most part, I'm really going to be talking about book 1 out of the 8 books, as well as the last book, which again is slightly more philosophical than the middle 6. So for the first book, it really starts out kinda not really on the life of Cyrus himself, but more cataloguing or kinda going over Persian society at the time, especially Persian society as it was for the youth, for the young, and in terms of education. And probably the most striking thing about this is two things. Number one, that education at the time was public, and while it was never especially stated by Xenophon, it seems to be heavily implied that it was public as well as completely free education across the board. There's also a great mention of the kind of equality under the law. Absolutely anyone in any class could have got an education, equal to someone above them, someone below them, regardless of kind of class, rank, any freeborn male could have got this education for free. And then there's a second factor which was even more interesting, which was the which was, well, kind of more typical things that we'd expect to be taught in a school: maths, science, and so on. Really, the main thrust of the Persian education system seemed to be highly focused on the idea of virtue, morality, culture, and instilling such. So, for example, the students were taught self-restraint, temperance, class visits after classes. They would sit on real court cases at the time, crimes of anything from murder to petty theft, and both they would get to have philosophical discussions about the case. thinker in terms of deciding what is virtuous, what is not virtuous, and what would have been just and fair in this specific trial. As well as on top of that, in the same manner, it doesn't seem to be as extreme. They were forced to undergo certain hardships. For example, for a long period of time they were forced to kind of sleep outside rather than being able to be at home with their families. The students were actually kind of assigned outside around various public buildings where they would sleep basically homely. And actually having people sleeping outside, a very large amount of young, many of which would have been military age men. They would obviously be able to alert the city, defend the city better, whether if everyone was in their house during the night. And again, instilling this certain character of self-restraint, of temperance, and of virtue. The ideas of temperance, virtue, self-restraint, fairness, there aren't much that it goes into. It does go into one case between Cyrus and one of his masters, one of his school teachers, in which there's a dispute between two other boys. One of them has a big cloak, but it's small. The other one's small and has a big cloak, and he tries to kind of settle the decision by swapping over the cloaks because they get a fight with them. Whether as a result of this, his master rather scolds him, saying that, well, one cloak may be fitting for other boys, determined on their sizes. Nonetheless, what is right is to go by property rights, is to go by the law, is to go by the fact that even although for practicality's sake one boy might not need a certain cloak, the other may, nonetheless there is an ownership over that. That cloak was bought, it was made for someone. And again, these are very basic anecdotes, but nonetheless, and of course in the book they're told are far more interesting to Anne. After that, it really goes into anecdotes about hunting, which were interesting enough themselves. Certain dangers about hunting different kinds of animals, about Cyrus kind of going out on his first hunting expeditions with the king, with his fellow friends and followers. This was all written by Xenophon, so a tinge of salt does have to be taken whether how much of this is accurate, how much of it's to the letter. For example, in terms of the actual dialogue that he places in it, can we assume that a lot of it probably wasn't accurate, highly paraphrased. But regardless, this at the time was really shocking, whereas the king, him being his son, the prince, says that he should go first, he should get the first kill, and that no man should come before him unless he says so. Cyrus rather makes the effort to say that he shouldn't be put in front of anyone else if they can do the same work, and that he wants his fellow colleagues to hunt alongside him rather than behind him. Again, the way that it's written in the book is obviously going to be far more interesting than the way that I say it. In the book it really does put you in at the place. After that it goes into some kind of philosophical discussions about the army, about generalship, about what it is to be a good general. For example, Cyrus states that if the people under a general's command are to be loyal to him, he should go through the same hardships that they go through. He should always lead in the front. If they undergo hunger, he should go undergo hunger if they're going to go first, etc, etc. Again, there are probably a few anecdotes that I'm forgetting. nonetheless, the way that the story was told, it's all quite interesting. And there was another anecdote about his grandfather, who was a Mede, about his drunkenness and kind of discussions about that, debates about drunkenness and temperance between the grandson and the grandfather. After that, unfortunately, much of this, I do admit that my attention waned a bit, because it went away from philosophical discussions, which is what I'm mainly interested in. Philosophy, anthropology, seeing how these peoples and these societies worked, to more just military stuff in terms of numbers of, in terms of really just the day-to-day history and techniques of the army, number of troops, certain battle formations, them making alliances with other cities, then conquering other cities. And at least for the vast majority of this, I did find it quite dull. There was still some more interesting things in it, but again, I'm not really out here about certain armies conquering other cities or whatnot. The only one that I did find interesting was Babylon, which comes at the very end of the book, or rather book 7 of the 8 books. But for the most part, it was really coming into book 8. At the end of book 7, when Cyrus and his great army is actually taken over Babylon, they've infiltrated the walls and they've captured the city. There's a kind of discussion about eunuchs, which, and of course this stuff, especially in terms of other discussions, other very fine discussions, which can really be settled over which aren't as important as eunuchs. It can be shocking to read this sort of stuff. But yeah, basically, and again, in terms of him saying after the fact, but he does basically just describe how that Cyrus wanted all of his staff around him, all of his attendants, all of his servants, all of his personal slaves, all of his personal guards, everyone that was really around him and was supposed to be subservient to him in any way, to be a eunuch. If a horse is unruly, if a colt is unruly, the common practice at the time, and to a certain extent even today, would be to castrate it and make it a groundling, because it becomes less unruly, it becomes more obedient, it becomes more loyal towards its master. A sort of its passion is companion, or rather servant for its master. We find it's really changing the horse's behaviour on to instill not only the virtue of unicism, well, in terms of stating that compared to their peers they'd be no less able to serve their master. After that, got friends. He says that the kind of standards that he expects from himself in terms of self-restraint, in terms of self-will, his virtue, However, when talking about rather the slaves he owns and the slaves in his empire, that's one of the kind of virtue that he would exercise, or the men around him would exercise rather. He goes forth to be a great beneficiary to them. He feeds them well, he clothes them fairly well, he gives them good drink, the reason that someone might have a horse and eat them well. If that dog, for example, on some other work, someone might treat that dog specifically kindly, specifically well, let it eat before them, and he does mark out that Cyrus would specifically let all of his slaves eat before he did, because if the dog or the horse, or in this case the slave, is treated specifically kindly, in some ways even above its master, it will show a certain kind of loyalty, love, kindness and obedience towards him. So in terms of his good treatment towards his slaves, much like the eunuch, it's surely just a way of control of them, of curtailing them, to get them essentially to love the chains that they're binded to. And when it comes to talking about things like this, it's very easy to see Cyrus just on the basis of those two things, in terms of making all of his personal slaves eunuchs, and in terms of not only just owning slaves, but treating them well with the Pacific, treating them well under the Pacific guideline and Pacific idea of them being loyal to him, being more obedient to him. One wouldn't really care about a horse or a dog, solely for obedience. Spoken of to treating the free men around him, his friends, his allies, he's said to be magnanimously generous, like generous to really. There's several kind of discussions in the last book about him giving away great gifts, giving away great wealth, great riches, and the men around him being kind of bamboozled about this, being confused about this, asking how he could give away so much when he could be so much richer. And through several demonstrations he shows that the riches that he gets from the obedience of his friends, of his subjects, of his allies is actually far higher. And he kind of states out that if he really did have such great ability, other tyrants like many other despots, he would just have more wealth to guard, he would need to hire more guards, more men to protect it, taller walls. It would be a constant fear for his life. The men around him would constantly have suspicion or greed or envy of his wealth, so his life, his estate, his empire would constantly put in danger. To a certain extent he would be done by it, and as he also says, he can only eat so much, he can only drink so much,